The San Francisco federal courtroom fell into a tense silence. Judge William Grant, a man in his 50s with shrewd gray eyes and silver temples, listened attentively to the prosecutor's closing arguments. His stern face, honed by years of legal practice, expressed nothing but focused attention. His black robe gave his figure a special significance, and his reputation as a ruthless crime fighter made those present tremble. "So, Your Honor," the prosecutor concluded, "the evidence clearly points to the defendant's guilt in the case of grand corruption." Judge Grant nodded slightly, making notes in his notebook. This trial had attracted the attention of the entire San Francisco community. The defendant, a former city councilman, was involved in a multi-million-dollar real estate scam. "The court will recess until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning," Grant said with unwavering authority in his voice. "Tomorrow, we will hear the defense's closing arguments." As the room began to empty, the judge's attention involuntarily turned to a young woman sitting in the last row. Laura Baker, a 21-year-old third-year law school intern, was taking notes in a small notebook. Her brown hair was gathered into a neat bun, and her elegant suit emphasized her seriousness. Unlike the other trainees who hurried out of the room, she remained seated, immersed in her thoughts. Grant gathered up his papers and headed for the exit, but he stopped abruptly at the row where Laura was sitting. "Miss Baker, if I'm not mistaken," he said, forcing the girl to look up from her notes. "Yes, Your Honor." She stood up, clearly surprised that the judge knew her name. "Professor Cohen spoke highly of you. Said you were one of the most promising students in the class." Grant allowed himself a slight smile. "What conclusions did you draw from today's meeting?" Laura straightened, gathering her thoughts. "I think the prosecutor placed a strong emphasis on the documentary evidence but failed to establish motive convincingly," she said with unexpected confidence. "If I were on the defense side, that's what I would focus on." Grant's eyebrows raised in surprise. Few would dare to make such a blunt comment. "That's an interesting observation, Miss Baker. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in a more appropriate setting." He paused. "I hold informal meetings with prospective trainees. If you are interested, my secretary will pass on the details." William Grant didn't wait for a reply, nodded and left the room, leaving Laura slightly confused. An assistant was waiting for him outside the door with a folder of new documents. The routine of a federal court judge consumed him, but thoughts of the young intern never left his mind. In his spacious office, William Grant took off his robe and sank heavily into a leather chair. The walls, hung with diplomas and photographs of influential politicians, were silent reminders of his impeccable career. 25 years in the law, 15 as a federal judge. He was a living legend in the San Francisco legal world. But behind the facade of a successful officer of the law was another man. A man tired of routine, of the predictability of his own life, of his cold relationship with his wife. A man who felt as if real life was passing him by. Grant opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a photograph taken years ago. A young lawyer with burning eyes, full of ambition and hope. "What happened to that guy?" he thought, returning the picture to its place. His musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," Grant said, instantly reverting to his image of the unapproachable judge. Professor David Cohen, a longtime friend of Grant's from law school days, entered the office. Unlike William, Cohen had chosen an academic career and was now one of the leading professors at the law school. "Thought I'd stop by before you came home," Cohen said, settling into the chair across from him. "I hear the city councilman's case is coming to a close," Cohen said, nodding. "Tomorrow's the last day," Grant nodded. "I think we'll have a verdict by Thursday night." "Is Jennifer planning anything special to celebrate the conclusion of such a high-profile case?" Cohen asked, alluding to the judge's wife. Grant's face tensed slightly. "I doubt it. Jennifer has her own schedule of events that rarely overlaps with mine." Cohen nodded understandingly, not wanting to continue the unpleasant topic. "By the way, I saw you talking to Laura Baker today," the professor said, changing the subject. "One of my best students, talented girl." "Yes, I've noticed her in a few meetings," Grant replied, trying to sound indifferent. "She stands out among the other interns." Cohen looked at his friend carefully as if calculating something in his mind. "William, I've known you too long," he said at last. "Be careful. Your reputation is too valuable to risk." Grant straightened, his face impenetrable. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you do." Cohen stood up. "Just remember that you're always under more scrutiny than the average person. Also, Laura is not as simple as she may seem." After Cohen left, the judge sat in the silence of the office for a long time, pondering his friend's words and his own intentions. His reputation was his armor, his shield, and at the same time his prison. The thought of jeopardizing it was absurd, and yet the image of Laura Baker, her confidence and lively mind, never left him. The Laurel Leaf restaurant was located in a quiet corner of San Francisco's financial district. Dimmed lights, fine cuisine, and impeccable service made it an ideal place for business meetings. William Grant sat at a corner table, hidden from view, and glanced at his watch. It was 20 minutes past 8 in the evening. Laura Baker appeared at 8 o'clock sharp, dressed in an elegant navy blue dress that looked formal enough for a business meeting, but at the same time emphasized her youth and attractiveness. "I'm sorry I'm late, Your Honor," she said, taking a seat. "William, please," Grant replied with a slight smile. "We're just colleagues here discussing legal matters." The waiter brought the menu, and Grant ordered a bottle of expensive wine, despite Laura's slight confusion. "Don't worry, Miss Baker. One glass won't violate the ethics of our professional relationship," he assured her. "In that case, you should call me by my first name too," she replied, accepting the rules of the game. The conversation began with a discussion of current litigation, then turned to legal theory, and Grant was pleasantly surprised by the young student's depth of knowledge. She spoke passionately about constitutional law, citing case law, and asking questions that made him think. "Why did you decide to become a judge?" Laura asked when the conversation became more casual. Grant hesitated, swirling his wine glass in his hand. "I've always believed in the power of the law," he answered after a pause. "In law school, I dreamed of making a difference in the world through fair decisions. Naive, isn't it?" "Not at all," Laura countered. "That's why I chose law, although many people think I'm too idealistic." "Including Professor Cohen?" Grant asked. Laura tensed slightly. "Professor Cohen is a complicated man. He supports me, but sometimes I think he has his own plans for my future." Grant looked at her carefully, trying to understand the hidden meaning of her words, but Laura changed the subject. "And how does your family feel about your career? It must be hard being the wife of a federal judge." "My wife?" Grant paused, searching for words. "Jennifer leads her own life, charitable activities, social functions. We've been living in different worlds for a long time, even though we're under the same roof." He was surprised at his own candor. Something about this girl had an openness he hadn't allowed himself in a long time. The evening went on, and with each glass of wine, the distance between them shrank. As Grant helped Laura into her coat, his fingers lingered on her shoulders a little longer than necessary. "I hope we can continue our discussions," he said as he walked her to the cab. "I hope so too, William," Laura replied with a smile that could have meant anything. Judge Grant's home was located in the upscale neighborhood of Pacific Heights, overlooking the San Francisco Bay. When William returned home, Jennifer was waiting for him in the spacious living room. An elegant woman in an expensive house dress, with impeccable styling and a cold stare. "Did the meeting take too long?" she asked, not looking up from her clipboard. "Meeting with one of the interns," Grant replied, heading for the bar. "Professional mentoring." "Of course," she said, a subtle sarcasm in her voice. "Your secretary called. Reminded me about the fundraiser on Friday. Jennifer, I'm not sure I can attend. City councilman business." "Of course, your job always comes first," she interrupted. "I've already told the organizers that you probably won't be coming. As usual." Grant poured himself a whiskey and took a sip, feeling his irritation growing. 20 years of marriage, William," Jennifer continued, setting aside her clipboard. 20 years I've been the perfect judge's wife, maintained your image, your reputation, and now you don't even try to pretend you care. You didn't try very hard to keep our marriage together either," Grant countered. "Your endless events, your girlfriends, your trips. What was I supposed to do?" There was bitterness in her voice. "To be a shadow of a man who lived only for his work? Grant didn't answer. These conversations were repeated with enviable regularity, never leading to a solution. "Do you have someone?" Jennifer asked suddenly, taking him by surprise. "Don't deny it, I can see the change." "You're out of your mind," Grant replied coldly. "My reputation is too important to risk for an affair." "Reputation," Jennifer repeated with a chuckle. "Always a reputation in everything. You know, sometimes I think you married me just because marrying a senator's daughter looked good on your resume." She stood up and headed for the stairs leading to the second floor. "I'm going to New York for the weekend. Contemporary art exhibit. Don't expect me back until Tuesday." When the sound of her footsteps faded, Grant finished his whiskey and went to the window. The lights of the city flickered below, and his reflection in the glass looked blurred and indistinct, as if it were losing its shape. The next day at the courthouse, Professor Cohen watched Laura Baker enter the courtroom. He noticed the slight smile that flashed across her face at the sight of Judge Grant and the exchange of glances between them. Frowning, the professor made a mental note to follow the developments more closely. Too much was at stake to let ill-considered feelings ruin everything. 2 weeks after their first meeting at the restaurant, William Grant and Laura Baker were sitting in a secluded cottage on the coast of Marin County, an hour's drive from San Francisco. The sea breeze swayed the translucent curtains, and the setting sun colored the room in golden tones. A bottle of champagne in an ice bucket and 2 glasses stood on the coffee table. "I can't believe we're doing this," Laura said, looking out the panoramic window at the ocean. "How did we even get to this point?" Grant came up behind her and put his arm around her shoulders. "You have doubts?" "No," she turned to him. "It's just that it all happened so fast. A month ago I was sitting in a classroom listening to a lecture on judicial ethics. And now you're breaking every conceivable rule of those ethics with me." Grant finished for her with a slight smile. They had met 4 times in the past 2 weeks, first under the pretext of professional mentoring, then openly for each other's sake. The cottage, which belonged to an old friend of Grant's, had become their secret hideaway. There was no judge or student here, just a man and a woman caught up in a sudden passion. "Tell me about your family," Grant asked as they settled on the sofa with glasses of champagne. Laura hesitated, as if searching for words. "There's not much to tell. I grew up in the suburbs of Seattle. My father left when I was 8. My mother worked 2 jobs to provide for me and my younger brother. Typical middle-class story. And how did you end up in the law?" "My uncle was a lawyer," Laura said. "Not a particularly successful one, but passionate about the law. When I used to visit him, he would tell me about famous trials, great judges. I remember him saying, 'The law is the only thing that protects the weak from the strong.'" She took a sip of champagne. "When I was 16, our family tried to be evicted from our home because of some banking error. A pro bono lawyer from a community organization saved us. That's when I decided I wanted to be a lawyer." Grant listened intently, trying to see the real Laura behind the story. Sounds noble, but law school in San Francisco, an internship in federal court. That sounds more like career ambition than a desire to help people. Laura shrugged. "You can't change the world from the position of a lawyer giving free counseling in the ghetto. Real change requires power." "Do you want power?" Grant asked, looking at her intently. "I crave justice," she replied, holding his gaze. Wasn't that what young William Grant wanted? He did not answer, but in his heart he recognized her rightness. He too had once longed to change the world through justice. Once upon a time. "What about Professor Cohen?" Grant suddenly asked. "You two seem close." A slight shadow ran across Laura's face. "He's been my thesis advisor since freshman year. Noticed me, helped me with recommendations, helped me get an internship." "And what does he want in return?" Laura looked away. "Professor Cohen, he's a complicated man. He has his own ideas about my future." "What kind of ideas?" Grant insisted. "Perhaps we could talk about something more pleasant?" Laura set down her glass and moved closer. "We have so little time together." Her fingers touched his arm, and the conversation was forgotten in the haze of passion that engulfed them both. Jennifer Grant sat in the spacious living room of her home, leafing through the photos in her clipboard. The charity event in New York was behind her, and now she was scrutinizing the pictures she had taken that evening. In most of them, she looked flawless. An elegant evening gown, a perfect smile, and a deliberately interested gaze directed toward her companions. The ideal wife of a judge, maintaining her husband's image even in his absence. The ringing of her cell phone interrupted her thoughts. "Yes, speaking," she said into the receiver. "Mrs. Grant? This is Raymond Clark, private investigator. You asked me to find some information about—" "I remember what I asked you to do, Mr. Clark," Jennifer interrupted him coldly. "Do you have any news?" "Preliminary results," the detective replied. "Your husband does spend a lot of time with a young woman. Her name is Laura Baker, 21 years old, a law student, an intern in federal court." Jennifer felt her heart clench. It was one thing to suspect adultery, quite another to get confirmation. "Do you have proof of their intimacy?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "So far only pictures of meetings in restaurants and trips to the country together, but the behavior indicates an intimate relationship. I'll continue the surveillance and—" "No," Jennifer cut him off. "Send me what you have and continue surveillance, but no action without my direct orders." After the call, Jennifer sat still for a long time, staring at one point. 20 years of marriage was crumbling before her eyes. 20 years given to a man for whom she had always been just a part of his impeccable image. She opened a desk drawer and pulled out a photograph. Young William and Jennifer on the steps of law school, full of hope and plans for the future. Where had those two in the picture disappeared to? The phone rang again. This time it was William. "Hi," he said in his usual businesslike tone. "How was the exhibition?" "Fine," Jennifer replied, instantly putting on her mask of indifference. "I met some useful people. And how was your corruption case?" "Finished yesterday." The jury returned a guilty verdict. "How predictable," she said with a touch of irony. "When can I expect you home?" "Late. Don't wait up for dinner." "I never wait, William," Jennifer replied quietly and hung up the phone. She went to the window and looked out at the lights of the city. To all of San Francisco, they were the perfect couple, a respected judge and his impeccable wife. No one knew how empty that shell was. Now, even that illusion was crumbling. Jennifer went back to her desk and opened her email. The first email from the detective had already arrived, with photos attached. Her fingers froze over the keyboard, but then she resolutely clicked on the attachment icon. Professor David Cohen tapped his fingers nervously on the tabletop, waiting in Judge Grant's office. When the door finally opened, he jumped up abruptly. "William, we need to have a serious talk." Grant walked calmly to his chair, removed his robe, and hung it on the counter. "I'm listening, David. What's so urgent?" "The Solar Dynamics Corporation case." Cohen stepped forward. "It's scheduled for next month, and I hear it's been assigned to you." "That's right," Grant nodded. "Securities fraud charges, so? You should recuse yourself," Cohen said seriously. "You have a clear conflict of interest." Grant looked at his old friend carefully. "What conflict are you talking about?" "Don't pretend, William. I know about your relationship with Laura Baker." The judge's face petrified. "Are you following me, David?" "It doesn't take a detective to notice the way you look at each other," Cohen replied. "But that's not the problem. The problem is that Laura was practicing at the law firm representing Solar Dynamics. She had access to the case files." Grant went pale. "That's impossible. She's interning at a court, not a private firm." "Double internship," Cohen explained. "My recommendation helped her get a spot at Bernstein and Associates last semester. It's standard practice for top students." "Why didn't she tell me that?" Grant muttered, more to himself than to his interlocutor. Cohen sighed. "Because Laura Baker isn't as simple as you think. She has her own goals, and she's willing to use any means to achieve them." "What do you mean?" "Her father didn't leave when she was 8 years old," Cohen said. "He was convicted of fraud. And you know who the judge at that trial was? James Holloway, your predecessor. Laura vowed revenge on the judicial system that she felt had destroyed their family." Grant looked at Cohen with disbelief. "How do you know all this?" "I've been Laura's supervisor since freshman year. She told me a lot about her life." Cohen paused. "And about her plans." "What plans?" "It doesn't matter," Cohen dismissed. "What matters is that you need to end this relationship and recuse yourself from the Solar Dynamics case. Otherwise, when the truth comes out, and it will, Believe me, your career will be destroyed." Cohen stood up and headed for the door, but before he left, he turned around. "One more thing, William, be careful. Laura is not who she says she is." Alone, Grant felt his anxiety growing inside. What if Cohen was right? What if Laura was using him for some purpose of her own? He pulled out his cell phone and dialed her number. "We need to meet," he said as soon as she answered. "Tonight." At the same time, Laura Baker was sitting in a cafe on the university campus, looking through constitutional law materials. The vibration of the phone made her flinch. Seeing the caller's name, she quickly answered. "William? Is something wrong?" After listening to his brief message, she agreed to a meeting and disconnected. Something in his voice alerted her. Perhaps he was getting suspicious? Or had someone noticed something? Laura closed the book and took a deep breath. Things were getting too complicated, too dangerous. Even at the beginning of their relationship, she'd understood the risks, but she couldn't resist the temptation. William Grant wasn't just a judge. He was her gateway to a world of power and opportunity. His connections, his position, could open doors that would otherwise have remained closed to her. But it wasn't just a matter of calculation. Something about this man touched her more deeply than she'd expected. His intelligence, his experience, even his internal struggle between duty and desire, all of it drew her in, making her forget her original intentions. Her musings were interrupted by another phone call. Professor Cohen's name came up on the screen. "Professor?" she answered, trying to sound calm. "Laura, we need to talk." Cohen's voice sounded tense. "Now." "I'm in class until 4, she began, but he interrupted her. "That's out of the question. My office, 20 minutes. In Professor Cohen's office, Laura felt like a first-year student again, unsure and vulnerable. Cohen looked at her with an expression she couldn't decipher, a mixture of frustration and anxiety. "What's going on between you and Judge Grant?" he asked without preamble. Laura tried to keep her composure. "I don't know what you mean." "Come on," Cohen slapped his palm on the table. "I'm not blind. The whole court is already whispering about your looks and chance encounters." Laura was silent, feverishly calculating her options. "Do you realize what you're risking?" Cohen continued. "Not just your career, but his position. If this gets out, Grant loses his robe, and you lose any chance of working in the legal field." "You're exaggerating," she finally replied. "We're just friends." "Friends?" Cohen grinned bitterly. "Do you think I'm an idiot? I was at Grant's today. I told him about your internship at Bernstein and Associates and the solar dynamics case." Laura turned pale. "Why did you do that?" "To protect you both," Cohen replied. "But more importantly, to protect our plan. Have you forgotten why you went to law school? Have you forgotten what we agreed to?" "I haven't forgotten anything," Laura said quietly. "But things have changed." "Nothing has changed," Cohen said sternly. "Your father is still rotting in prison because of a wrongful conviction. The judicial system still protects the rich and powerful at the expense of people like your family. And William Grant is part of that system, don't forget that." Laura stood up, her hands trembling slightly. "I have to go. I have a class." "Think of the consequences, Laura," Cohen warned as she headed for the door. "If you continue this relationship, everything we've worked for over the years will be destroyed, and I won't be able to protect you." The secret meeting at the seaside cottage that evening was tense. Grant sat in an armchair with a glass of whiskey, watching Laura walk nervously around the room. "Cohen told me about your father," he said at last. Laura stopped, her face stiff. "And what exactly did he tell you?" "That your father had been convicted of fraud, that Judge Holloway had passed sentence, that you swore vengeance. And you believed it?" "I don't know what to believe, Laura," Grant replied tiredly. "All I know is that you didn't tell me the truth about yourself, about your internship at Bernstein and Associates, about access to the solar dynamics case files." Laura sank down on the couch across from him. "I didn't lie to you, William. I just didn't tell you everything. What's the difference?" "It's a big difference," she leaned forward. "Yes, my father was convicted. Yes, it destroyed our family, but I never swore revenge. I vowed to change the system that allows these mistakes to happen." What about us? Grant asked, looking her straight in the eye. Is that part of your plan to change the system too? Seduce the judge to gain influence? Laura flinched as if slapped. How can you think that? What am I supposed to think? Grant raised his voice. You've kept important facts from me. You interned at a firm that represents the interests of the company whose case I'll be reviewing. It's a direct conflict of interest, Laura. You're jeopardizing everything. My career, your future. I didn't know the case would be referred to you, she objected. When I interned at Bernstein and Associates, it hadn't been scheduled for trial yet. And yet you didn't tell me about it when you found out. Laura remained silent, recognizing his point. What is it between you and Cohen? Grant asked after a pause. He talked about some kind of plan. What does that mean? Laura took a deep breath. Professor Cohen was my father's lawyer. He was the only one who believed in his innocence. When I went to law school, Cohen took me under his tutelage. He thought that together, we could prove that my father was the victim of a miscarriage of justice. And me? What role do I play in that plan? None, Laura answered firmly. What we have between us is not part of anyone's plan. It happened out of the blue for me. Grant wanted to believe her. He really did. But the doubts Cohen had planted had taken too deep a root. I have to recuse myself from the Solar Dynamics case, he said finally. And we need to stop seeing each other. At least until things are clearer. Laura felt her insides clench with pain. You don't trust me? This isn't about trust, Grant replied. It's about the law, the rules I've dedicated my life to. Rules are more important than feelings? She asked bitterly. Sometimes they are, he said quietly. Otherwise, how am I any different from the men I put behind bars? Laura stood up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You know, William, sometimes I think you're so afraid to really live that you hide behind your rules and your reputation, but reputation won't keep you warm at night. And when you're alone with your principles, remember this moment. She headed for the door, but Grant stopped her by grabbing her arm. Laura, wait. Let's talk. Talk about what? She wrenched her hand away. You've made up your mind. Your precious reputation comes first, more important than me. You don't understand. If this gets out... If? Laura interrupted him. William, your wife's already hiring detectives to follow you. Grant froze. What? How do you know that? One of my classmates works at a detective agency. She saw an order from Jennifer Grant to spy on her husband. The news hit Grant like a hammer. If Jennifer really is gathering evidence of his infidelity, things could get a lot more serious than he realized. That changes things, he muttered. I need to prepare myself for a possible scandal. And how are you going to do that? Laura asked. Deny everything? Make me look like a prestige hunter who seduced a respected judge? The look on Grant's face told her that she had hit the mark. I see, Laura said coldly. Reputation comes first, even if it means sacrificing mine. She opened the door, letting in the cool evening air. Goodbye, William. I hope your reputation is worth what you're losing. When the door slammed shut, Grant was alone in the empty cottage, with a glass of whiskey and heavy thoughts about how his life had become such a tangled ball of lies and mistrust. Saturday came, and William Grant woke up to an empty house. Jennifer had left to visit her parents in Napa Valley, leaving a short note saying she would return Sunday night. In the week since the dramatic scene with Laura at the cottage, his life had become a mechanical existence. Court, house, sleepless nights, repetition. Grant went down to the kitchen, poured himself some coffee, and stopped at the panoramic window overlooking the bay. Fog shrouded the Golden Gate Bridge, giving the landscape a ghostly appearance. Like his life, Grant thought. Everything was blurring, losing clarity. A phone call snapped him out of his reverie. David Cohen's name came up on the screen. David? Is something wrong? Grant asked, answering the phone. We need to meet, William. It's urgent. Cohen's voice sounded tense. I have some information you'll be very interested in. It's about Laura Baker. I thought we'd closed that subject, Grant replied coldly. Believe me, you'll want to hear what I've discovered, Cohen insisted. It's not only about your reputation, but also your safety. Can I come to your house? Jennifer's out of town, right? Grant hesitated a moment. Something in Cohen's voice made him wary. "All right, come over. I'll be home all day." After the conversation, Grant felt a growing unease. What kind of security was Cohen talking about? And how did he know Jennifer wasn't home? The doorbell rang around 11 in the morning. Cohen stood on the doorstep holding a leather briefcase. His usually well-groomed appearance had changed to one of feverish nervousness, his shirt collar unbuttoned, his hair disheveled, his eyes racing. "Come in," Grant said, letting his friend in. "You don't look well. What's wrong?" Cohen walked into the living room and dropped his briefcase on the couch. "What I was afraid of, William. Laura and her father are using you in their game." "What are you talking about?" Grant frowned. Cohen pulled a file folder out of his briefcase. "I've done my own investigation. Laura's father, Richard Baker, wasn't just a small-time crook. He was involved with organized crime, laundering money through shell companies." Cohen spread the documents out on the coffee table. "And you know what I found? One of those companies is connected to Solar Dynamics." "That's impossible," Grant muttered, looking through the documents. "What's more," Cohen continued, "Laura didn't just intern at Bernstein and Associates. She was specifically gathering information on the Solar Dynamics case, and the notes she took during your court hearings, they're not notes, but a detailed analysis of your decision-making style." Grant looked up from the documents. "You're saying that she trying to manipulate you to influence the outcome of the Solar Dynamics case," Cohen finished. "The romance was just a way to get to you. She and her father devised a plan before she even got to law school. If it's like you say, why didn't you go to the police?" Grant asked, feeling the anger building inside him at Laura, at Cohen, at himself for being blind. Cohen looked away. "Because I was in on it too. I was Richard Baker's lawyer. I knew he was guilty, but I tried to get him out anyway because..." He hesitated. "Because he's my brother." Grant felt the room swirl around him. "Your brother? You've been lying to me all these years?" "Richard and I are half-brothers, different last names," Cohen explained. "No one knew we were related. When he was convicted, I vowed to help him and took custody of Laura, helped her get into law school, become your intern." "Jesus, David." Grant slumped in his chair, stunned by the revelation. "You used our friendship to help my brother, yes," Cohen admitted. "But then things got out of hand. Laura actually fell in love with you, which wasn't part of the plan. And now Richard's threatening to expose the whole story if I don't help him get out. He's blackmailing me, William." The doorbell interrupted their conversation. Grant glanced at his watch, 12:30. "Are you expecting someone?" Cohen asked warily. "No." Grant headed for the door. "Wait here." When he opened the door, he saw Laura, pale and determined. "I need to talk to you," she said without preamble. "This isn't a good time," Grant replied, instinctively trying to close the door. "It can't wait," Laura insisted, walking into the house. "I found out something about Professor Cohen, and you have to..." She froze when she saw Cohen himself standing in the doorway of the living room. "What is he doing here?" Her voice trembled. "Telling me the truth," Grant answered coldly. "The truth you've been hiding." At that moment, the front door opened again, and Jennifer Grant entered the house. Her appearance caused a moment's confusion for everyone present. "You were supposed to be back tomorrow," Grant remarked, feeling the situation growing more tense. "Obviously, I came back early," Jennifer replied icily, glancing around at the unexpected gathering. "Professor Cohen, Miss Baker. What an interesting choice of guests for a Saturday morning, dear." The living room of the Grant house had become a silent battlefield. 4 people, bound by secrets and deceit, were in the same space, like pieces on a chessboard before a decisive move. "Maybe I should leave." Cohen broke the silence, taking a step toward the exit. "Stay, David," Grant said firmly. "Now that we're all here, let's set the record straight." He turned to Laura. "Professor Cohen has told me everything. About your father, about your plan to use me to influence the Solar Dynamics case." "And you believed him," Laura exclaimed, glaring angrily at Cohen. "William, he's manipulating you. He didn't tell you that..." "That he's your father's brother?" Grant interrupted her. "He told me that too." Laura's face expressed genuine surprise. "What?" She turned to Cohen. "You and my father?" "Half-brothers," Cohen confirmed. I'm sorry, Laura. I should have told you sooner, but I don't understand, Jennifer interjected, watching the drama unfold. What are we talking about? Grant briefly explained the situation to his wife, watching her face change from surprise to anger. So it's true, Jennifer said quietly, looking at Laura. You really did sleep with my husband. That's not what we're talking about right now, Laura replied sharply. There's more involved here than your marital problems. Cohen stepped forward. Laura, all these years I've guided you, helped you because I felt responsible. Your father is my brother, and I couldn't let you be alone. You used me, Laura said bitterly. All this time I thought you were helping me because you believed my father's sentence was unfair. But you were just manipulating me to get to Judge Grant. It wasn't like that. Cohen started to justify himself, but Grant interrupted him. No more lies, David. You betrayed my trust. You used our friendship for your own ends. And you? Jennifer turned to her husband. You used our marriage as a cover while you were having fun with a girl who could be your daughter. The tension in the room reached a critical point. Everyone felt betrayed. Everyone was looking for someone to blame. I'm leaving, Jennifer announced abruptly. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow. Jennifer, wait! Grant tried to stop her. No, William. Her voice shook with rage. For 20 years, I've put up with your coldness, your obsession with work. But treason is something I cannot cross. She headed for the stairs, tossing over her shoulder. I'll pack my things and go to my parents' house. Have my lawyer contact yours. When the sound of her footsteps died down on the second floor, Laura turned to Grant. William, you have to listen to me. What Cohen says is not the whole truth. What is the truth, Laura? Grant asked tiredly. That you didn't use me? That our relationship was sincere? Yes, she exclaimed. Maybe it didn't start out the way it was supposed to, but what's between us is real. Cohen shook his head. Don't believe her, William. She's as skillful a manipulator as her father. You! Laura turned to the professor, her eyes burning with anger. All this time, you've been the source of the information leak. You've been telling my father about my every move, haven't you? You convinced him that I could help prove his innocence, when in fact... She stopped talking, suddenly realizing something. You never believed in his innocence, did you? You knew he was guilty, you always knew. But you used me to protect yourself, Grant finished for her, beginning to understand the whole picture. Were you in on his schemes too, David? Were you afraid he'd talk and drag you down with him? Cohen's face contorted. You don't understand anything. I was trying to make things right, to give Laura a chance at a normal life, to redeem myself. By using her as a pawn? Grant was outraged. Guiding her to me, knowing what would happen? Enough! Laura's voice sounded suddenly firm. I came here to tell the truth, and I will do so. William, I found documents in Cohen's office. He's not just my father's brother. He was an accomplice in a money laundering scheme. Money was funneled through his accounts. Cohen went pale. You're lying! I have copies of the documents with me, Laura replied, opening her bag. Account statements, correspondence between you and my father. It's all here. Grant looked at his old friend with disbelief and disgust. David, is it true? Instead of answering, Cohen rushed toward Laura, trying to snatch the documents from her hands. In the ensuing struggle, the papers flew across the floor. Grant hurried to separate them, pulling Cohen away from Laura. Calm down, he shouted, holding his friend back. You're just confirming what she said. You don't understand, Cohen exhaled hoarsely. If those documents get to the D.A. S office, I lose everything. My license, my job, my freedom. And I'm supposed to lose my reputation because of your machinations? Grant objected. That's enough, David. The game is over. At that moment, Jennifer's voice came from the stairs. William, what's going on up there? Nothing, Grant answered. Just settling a few things. He turned to Cohen. You'd better go. I'll see you in my office tomorrow with a confession. You wouldn't dare, Cohen hissed. I've been your friend for 25 years. And all that time you've been lying to me, Grant replied firmly. Go away, David. Now. Cohen rose slowly, his face contorted with anger and fear. You'll regret this, William. You'll both regret it. As the door slammed behind Cohen, Grant turned to Laura. You'd better go too. I need time to think things over. William, Please, he said tiredly. I'll contact you later." Laura nodded, picked up the scattered papers, and headed for the exit. She turned around at the door. "I really love you. Whatever you think, it's true." After she left, Grant stood in the middle of the living room for a long time, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. His life had become a shambles in one day. His wife is filing for divorce, his best friend has turned out to be a traitor, and the woman he had feelings for may have been using him all along. Detective Alex Torres arrived on a call at Judge Grant's house around 8 o'clock that Saturday evening. The patrol officer who met him at the entrance looked pale. "What do we got?" Torres asked, walking into the house. "A double murder, sir," the officer replied. "Judge William Grant and a young woman, presumably Laura Baker, judging from the papers in her bag." "Who discovered the bodies?" "The judge's wife, Jennifer Grant. She called 911 about an hour ago." Torres nodded and walked to the judge's office where the forensics team was working. Grant and Laura's bodies lay on the floor next to the massive oak desk. Grant was in his home clothes and Laura was still in her coat. She had apparently recently arrived. Both victims had suffered gunshot wounds to the chest. "Time of death?" Torres asked the medical examiner. "Tentatively between 6 o'clock and 7 p.m., he replied. "I'll know more after the autopsy." Torres looked around the room. There were no signs of a struggle, just an overturned chair and papers scattered on the floor. "Where's Mrs. Grant?" he asked the officer. "In the living room, with the psychologist." Jennifer Grant was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Her face was unmoving, her gaze blank. "Mrs. Grant," Torres began softly, taking a seat across from her. "I'm Detective Alex Torres. I'm very sorry about what happened. If you're able, I'd like to ask you a few questions." Jennifer nodded weakly. "I'll answer what I can. Tell me what happened." "I was packing upstairs," she began in a quiet voice. "William and I had decided to divorce. I heard Professor Cohen leave, and that girl. Then the house got quiet. I thought William had gone out to see them off. But when I came downstairs about an hour later, I noticed that the door to his study was ajar. I peeped in and..." Her voice trembled. "And there they were. Did you notice anything unusual? Did you hear any gunshots?" "No," Jennifer shook her head. "Our house is soundproof, and I was on the 3rd floor." "Who do you think could have done it?" Torres asked cautiously. "Professor Cohen," Jennifer answered without hesitation. "They had a big fight before he left. I didn't hear the whole conversation, but William threatened to expose some of his machinations." Torres made a note in his notebook. "And Miss Baker? What do you know about her?" "She was my husband's mistress," Jennifer replied coldly. "I found out recently. I came home earlier than I had planned this morning and found all 3 of them here." Torres continued his questioning, building up a picture of events. The story Jennifer had told seemed logical. Angry professor returns to threaten the judge. Laura Baker also shows up for one last chat, situation spiraling out of control. When the debriefing was over, Torres returned to the office where the forensics team was wrapping up their work. "Did you find anything interesting?" he asked the team leader. "No weapons were found," he replied. "No gunpowder residue on the victim's hands. But we found this." He handed Torres a clear bag of documents. "Looks like financial records linking Professor David Cohen to some shady operations." "Excellent," Torres nodded. "That confirms motive. Check it out thoroughly and collect samples for DNA analysis." The next day, Torres organized the arrest of Professor Cohen. He denied any involvement in the murders, but confessed to financial fraud in cooperation with Richard Baker. According to his testimony, he did return to Grant's house around 6 p.m. to try to negotiate with the judge, but found him dead with Laura. "Why didn't you call the police?" Torres asked during the interview. "I panicked," Cohen replied. "I thought I'd be charged with murder, especially after our fight. I just walked away." Cohen's testimony was corroborated by surveillance footage from nearby homes that recorded him coming and going. However, this did not completely clear him of suspicion. Meanwhile, forensic experts made an unexpected discovery. Microscopic traces of gunpowder were found on Jennifer Grant's clothes, which she turned in for analysis. In addition, when the crime scene was re-examined, a gun wrapped in a glove was found in the garden behind the house. Jennifer's fingerprints were found on both items. When Torres returned to the Grant home to re-interview the widow, He noticed an oddity. Jennifer seemed too calm for someone who had suffered such a tragedy. "Mrs. Grant," Torres began, sitting down across from her, "we found the gun that killed your husband and Miss Baker. Your fingerprints are on it." Jennifer turned slightly pale but kept her composure. "That's impossible. The only gun in the house was William's, and I never touched it." "But the examination showed gunpowder particles on your clothes," Torres continued. "That can only be explained by the fact that you were holding a gun that had recently been fired." "I don't know what you mean," Jennifer said firmly. "Maybe those particles got on me when I found the bodies." But Torres saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. "There's one more thing, Mrs. Grant," he said, pulling out a clipboard. "We checked your cell phone. On the day of the murder, you sent a text message to Laura Baker, inviting her to come to the house around 6 in the evening to talk. The message was sent from your number." Jennifer remained silent, staring into the space in front of her. "According to our records," Torres continued, "you were not packing up the 3rd floor as you claimed earlier. The smart home systems show that you were on the 1st floor the entire time between Professor Cohen's departure and Laura Baker's return." Jennifer's face changed. The calm mask slid away, revealing a mixture of rage and despair. 20 years, she whispered. 20 years I'd been a perfect wife. I put up with his coldness, his obsession with his career, and he traded me for the first girl he could find. "Did you kill them, Mrs. Grant?" Torres asked bluntly. Jennifer looked at him defiantly. "What would you have done in my place? He was going to divorce me, embarrass me in front of the whole community. For what? For an affair with a girl who could be his daughter. It was a confession." Torres showed her the arrest warrant. "Jennifer Grant, you're under arrest for the murder of William Grant and Laura Baker." As the cops led Jennifer away, she turned to Torres. "You know what the ironic thing is? I always cared more about his reputation than he did. I protected his name to the very end." 2 weeks later, Detective Torres sat in his office, finalizing his report on the Grant case according to the reconstruction of events. Jennifer, upon learning of her husband's infidelity, carefully planned her revenge. She sent Professor Cohen, making him think Grant was going to expose him, then invited Laura ostensibly to talk. When the girl arrived, Jennifer shot first her and then her husband when he entered the office after hearing the gunshot. After the murder, she hid the gun and gloves in the garden, went upstairs to create an alibi, and then discovered the bodies and called the police. The plan was almost perfect, but small details gave her away. Professor David Cohen was convicted of financial fraud and complicity in money laundering, receiving 8 years in prison. The solar dynamics case was referred to another judge and ended in an acquittal due to lack of evidence. Torres closed the file folder and rubbed his tired eyes. A typical story of passion and betrayal that ended in tragedy. The reputation Judge Grant held so dear had been ruined posthumously by a series of scandalous headlines. The perfect family, the model judge, the promising student, all the masks were torn off, exposing the lies and manipulation behind them. Blind justice, Torres thought, recalling a famous phrase. Blind not only to social status or wealth, but also to human weaknesses, which in the end proved to be stronger than any principles. The case was dismissed. The family drama of Judge William Grant was one more story in a long list of tragedies that Detective Torres had to investigate during his career. Another reminder that the facade of respectability often hides the darkest of human passions.